New law in Florida makes it illegal to sleep in public. This law is targeting homeless people. So what are homeless people supposed to do in Florida now? Stay awake for the rest of their lives? Many people who are homeless optionally because they consider it their own pursuit of happiness protected by the U.S. Constitution. And the rest of us are only one paycheck away from being homeless because we can't afford to live in Florida anymore. But if you do become homeless, you better not fall asleep in the state of Florida because being poor in Florida makes you a criminal. This is kind of reminding me of what life was like in Cuba, where the government decided that a particular group of people was evil and they had to be eliminated even if it was done unethically. Like literally, I lived in Cuba and living in Florida now, the laws that are taking place in Florida are reminding me of what life was like in Cuba, where the government marginalizes a particular group of people that they dislike, and the rest of us know that it's wrong, but we're afraid to say something because we're going to think maybe we're next. Let's get into today's video. A new law in Florida is going to prohibit sleeping in public. The state of Florida continues its war to make the lives of homeless people as miserable and illegal as possible. This law is a disappointment in a lot of ways, and it just goes to show that in the state of Florida, it is illegal to be poor. We're starting to see laws that are somewhat unconstitutional, somewhat tyrannical, somewhat illogical. I mean, I don't understand exactly how you're going to ban sleeping in public. If somebody is homeless, they immediately become a criminal, I guess. Anybody can end up homeless. I've been homeless. I had a house and I sold it. And in the meantime, we had nowhere to go. Me and my wife have slept in a vehicle in Florida, but now sleeping in public will be illegal. Recently, I had an injury and I got hurt. I had a surgery and I'm somewhat disabled moving forward now. And luckily, I have somehow been able to manage. But if I worked, let's say, in construction, we would be homeless by now. 6 months of reduced income and medical bills will literally go through any savings you may have. Most people might have 6 months savings, 1 year savings. It can happen to anybody. And the way the state of Florida is criminalizing homeless is concerning because many people who end up in that situation because of a hurricane. They end up in that situation because of an injury. They end up in that situation because of mental health. And now we have a new class, which is the working homeless. It's people who are disabled, and it costs $1,800, for example, to rent an apartment in Lee County, Florida. But a lot of people who are disabled or elderly, they won't even be able to make enough for the rent, let alone all their other needs. In other words, this is a law that pretty much criminalizes homelessness. I don't know how this law is being looked at, let's say, from a constitutional standpoint, basically saying, oh, if you're homeless, you have to sleep, and if you sleep in public, you're now a criminal. That sounds concerning. It sounds anti-constitutional. It sounds tyrannical, really. The problem in Florida is that it's a state that hasn't helped bring industries to the state. Other states like neighboring Alabama, for example, is much more affordable and they have better access to employment. There's car factories, there's vehicle production, there's car part production. There's a lot of industry in a state like Alabama. You have Mercedes-Benz, you have Hyundai, you have Kia, you have Toyota, you have Mazda. You have all these large auto manufacturing plants where the average person can be able to have a good source of income. Combine that with affordable housing, and poor people or unskilled people are able to make a living in a state like Alabama. However, in the state of Florida, the state hasn't attracted any type of industry. It depends on tourism, and jobs in tourism are seasonal, but your rent is full-time. The state of Florida really doesn't have any industries of that sort, and even if it did, it wouldn't be enough to keep up with the rent. People don't realize how poor Florida is. If you got rid of the top 1% of earners, the 99%, the vast majority of people in Florida, actually make less money than the person in Alabama. That just goes to show how poor the average person living in Florida is. But despite that, housing in a state like Florida can easily be twice as much as housing in Alabama. So here's a state that provides no good sources of income for people, has extraordinarily high cost of housing. Insurance is another nightmare in the state of Florida. And then on top of that, you're going to make it illegal for people to sleep in public when they finally go homeless because they're no longer able to afford it. In my case, I know people who are elderly and retired in Florida, and they're not really the type of people you would think would end up homeless. They don't have any vices or addictions. Just simple math. What somebody who's elderly and lives alone makes is not enough to pay housing and all your basic needs in the state of Florida. Now, the law has some provisions for how the state is going to help people that are homeless get help, but let's face it, we know how the state of Florida works. That's even the same lawmakers who made this law were confused about how unclear those provisions would be. Basically, they're not going to be. The state of Florida simply is going to start arresting people who are homeless when they are caught sleeping, which to me sounds completely unconstitutional, unethical. It's really shameful and embarrassing. So the person that really pushed this law is a Republican out of Clay County. We actually interviewed homeless people that were from Clay County, and they were pushed into the city limits of Jacksonville in the Duval County. So Clay County has one of the worst reputations considering how they go about treating homeless people, which is basically to persecute them. And this is really the way Florida takes homelessness now. I mean, it's not like anything's really going to change here. The state of Florida literally persecutes homeless people, so it's not like much is going to change. And because these individuals do not have access to income, they don't have access to lawyers. Many times the rights that me and you would have when we deal with law enforcement are stripped away from them when they have an encounter with law enforcement. Law enforcement goes on to destroy their property without a warrant. They trespass them in illegal methods, not the way the courts dictate it needs to happen. So this is already a marginalized sector of the population who is stripped of due process when dealing with law enforcement. Many times law enforcement will exaggerate the charges and put these people away for a very long time, and these people are completely defenseless. They don't have resources to combat the charges that are being pinned up against them, which is unconstitutional. You have to give people the ability to defend themselves legally. There's so many aspects of how Florida is handling the homeless population that goes against their own laws. It goes against due process, and it goes against the United States Constitution. You're stripping the rights of people away, or you're putting people in a situation where they're not able to enact or even carry out their rights because they're simply not able to, which is unconstitutional. But that's the way Florida has been dealing with this situation. You know, one of the reasons that people like the United States and consider it the greatest country in the world is because in the United States, the rule of law and due process means that in theory, in this country, you have justice. But when justice is perverted, when people's rights are stripped away from them, and when the law starts to take away people's rights and doesn't let them have access to due process, that's when people lose respect for their country. Because in theory, one of the greatest things that the United States has, it's the Constitution and your rights and liberties. But when those things are being encroached on, I don't really partake in the notion that somebody is less of a human than me because of their economical status. Nowhere does the United States founding fathers have the notion that a person needed to have economical resources to be a citizen. In fact, it kind of goes against the entire principles of how this country was founded. But regardless, the state of Florida is head on going to now enforce a law that prevents people from sleeping in public, which clearly is somewhat of an entrapment situation. Really, from a legal standpoint, I don't understand how this is going to work. And the reality of many of these laws in Florida and many of the laws that are taking place today is that they're more of a statement or a deterrent to homelessness. But in reality, if you're homeless, you are there because you have no other options. If you become homeless what laws are on the books really aren't going to make a difference. If you're homeless, you're homeless. And regardless of what the state's laws are, if you find yourself in that position, you are optionless. Don't ever think that you're too good to be homeless. I've bought houses cash. I've had hundreds of thousands of dollars cash in the bank, and a year or two later, something happens and overnight you're homeless. Don't ever assume that because you have $100,000 or $500,000 or $1 million that tomorrow you could get cancer, you could get hurt, you could get robbed, you could be extorted, you could have a judgment put against you. I've gone from $100 to $100,000 and from $100,000 to $1 literally overnight. Don't ever think that you're too good to be homeless. It's happened to me, and it can happen to anybody else. The enforcement of this law and how it will actually take place is a mystery, like everything else in Florida. Recently, SB 1718 passed, which was a law similar to this, but targeting migrant workers. They hid for a few months and everything's back to normal, okay? We still have a huge illegal population in Florida. SB 1718 changed absolutely nothing. Quite literally, the illegal immigrant situation in Florida now is worse than before SB 1718. Before 1718 took place, you had families that were partially legal, partially not legal. You had people that were here illegally, but they were working people with their families. So after SB 1718, now you're having an influx of Venezuelan gang members. You're having Haitians, you're having people from Africa, you're having people from all over the world are landing in Florida illegally. Crap, I was at the bank a few weeks ago and I saw a guy that was from Vietnam sleeping outside of my bank. You're starting to see people from all over the world end up in Florida. So even though SB 1718 was supposed to fix that problem, these trafficking organizations have their routes, they have their people. So the Hispanics that were coming before to work from Mexico or Guatemala, they're no longer coming to Florida, but now they're dumping in that void that was there before all these people from all these random countries. So what used to be people would come to Florida that were Hispanic to work, now you have people coming here from random countries that speak random languages. The situation is actually worse now in Florida. Having Guatemalans and Mexican is less of a security threat to the United States. They speak Spanish. Their home country is not that far away. Before, these human trafficking organizations were bringing Hispanics to Florida. Now that Hispanics are afraid to come to Florida, all the ones that are coming from really strange parts of the world, people who don't know the U.S. law, they don't know anything that's going on in the United States, these trafficking organizations are now dumping all those people in Florida because the trafficking network is in place, but they don't have people willing to come here. So anybody who's coming to the United States and has no idea getting trafficked in the United States, so these networks are just dumping these people on Florida now. So now you have all these random people from all over the world showing up in Florida, where before SB 1718, it was people from Guatemala and Mexico. So every time the state of Florida enacts one of these crazy illogical laws, you go from bad to worse. So what are homeless people gonna do? Simple. It's already happening in Florida. Homeless people are going to start to squat in empty houses. See, they're already marginalized and they're not quite illegally living, but with this new law coming to Florida, they will be living illegally. But if they squat in an empty property, I've already talked to homeless people about this topic, and the answer is simple. If you're already going to get arrested just for sleeping, you might as well sleep in somebody's house. So what the homeless people are going to do is any property that becomes vacant in Florida will become a squatted property for the homeless people. They're going to start breaking in the houses and squatting in these houses. And currently there's a lot of people in the state of Florida that own real estate. There's a lot of properties in Florida right now that are squatter occupied, and then the homeowners have to take these people to court and fight it out to get them evicted. So now they're turning a state problem on the sidewalk a problem that you, the homeowner, is going to have to deal with. So if you own investment real estate in Florida, here's another threat coming your way. You buy a rental property as an investment in Florida, your tenant moves out before you get somebody else in, boom, homeless people are now living in your property. You have to pay a lawyer, and you have to be responsible for evicting those people from your property, a process that can take months and that will quite literally destroy your property. Yeah, you just keep pushing these people around, and at some point they're going to snap. But what they're really going to do is they're going to start breaking into properties, because if it's illegal to sleep on the sidewalk, then, well, they might as well break the law, because they're already breaking the law. To get arrested for sleeping on a sidewalk, you may as well get arrested for breaking into a house. So the practical application of these laws happens on a city and municipal level, county level in the state of Florida. And every single county is going to do things in their own way. Some police departments are simply not going to give a crap about this law. SB 1718 is being handled the same way. There's some counties and some municipalities that they simply do not give a crap about these laws. They're going to do things the way they want. So just because a law is on the book in Florida doesn't mean that in practice it's going to happen. I mean, already due process in Florida doesn't happen the way it's supposed to. So what makes you think that all of a sudden they're going to play by the rules? Literally, the problem in the state of Florida is that instead of providing income for people, instead of providing housing, instead of providing people the opportunity so they can have things, they just try to make people disappear. We don't like illegals, let's make them disappear. We don't like homeless people, let's make them disappear. But who's next? That's the question with the state of Florida. Who is next? Because the state of Florida is becoming almost like what I left behind in Cuba, where if you're not what the government wants, you're going to disappear or go to prison. I mean, it's literally becoming in Florida where people are wondering who's going to be next. You know how you get rid of illegal immigrants? You have people working with a temporary visa. That's what other states are doing. They work, they come, once they're done, they leave. You provide a legal avenue because the state of Florida has great agricultural opportunities, but people that live their lives in Florida cannot live off of agriculture. But these Central Americans, they can manage it. It's a great deal for them. It would be a great deal for Florida to take advantage of all this agricultural land. But of course, the state of Florida actually wants agriculture to fail so they can rezone areas that were agricultural and turn them into housing subdivisions. So what used to be beautiful fields tomorrow is going to be nothing but more dense housing. You know, those cookie cutter communities where every single house looks the same. If you're living in the woods in Florida and you drive by a field and see workers picking tomatoes or picking strawberries, they want to rezone that agricultural land and turn it into subdivisions. So that's why the state of Florida wants to destroy agriculture. The state of Florida convinced the whole world that there's only 31,000 homeless people. But in a county like Manatee that reported just a few hundred homeless people, if you watch my videos, we've documented hundreds, if not thousands of homeless people within Manatee County. In fact, the local agencies that feed the homeless are telling us that there's at least 2,000 people in Manatee County that are homeless, but that contributes to that 31,000. Clay County, Florida, the county where this law is originating from, is a county that pretty much persecuted their homeless people and forced them all to move to Duval, the adjacent county. And now Clay County's homeless problem became Duval's homeless problem, and they're trying to do that on a state level. We knew this law was coming. We saw what St. Johns County, we've seen what Clay County, Volusia County, Brevard County, Lee County's now doing it, Manatee County's now doing it. So what the state of Florida is doing is like, oh, well, we've created a homeless problem. Let's push it into Alabama. Let's push it into Georgia. Let's dump our homeless population on other states. That's literally what the state of Florida is trying to do. Their own homegrown homeless problem here in Florida. Oh, it doesn't exist. No, it does exist. You're just making your problem somebody else's problem. They've been trying to push Florida's homeless out on a county level for a while now, and now they're going to try to implement it on a state level. So basically what the state of Florida is trying to do is, Here we have 100,000 homeless people. By the way, we're going to say there's only 30,000, but let's grab them and let's force them to leave the state of Florida, and then we'll have 0 homeless people. But you won't have them, not because the state of Florida inherently doesn't have a homeless problem. You won't have a homeless population. They're going to disappear because you're pawning off your homegrown problem on somebody else. And by the way, the adjacent states of Alabama and Mississippi, which claim to have the least homeless population in the United States, also happen to have the highest incarceration rates in the United States. Even the state of Alabama has now made it illegal to be homeless in Alabama. Thus, their homeless population exists, but not on the streets. It exists within the prison system. Basically, they don't have a visible homeless presence because all the people that would be homeless are in their state prisons. And of course, the larger the prison population, the larger their budget, the more money they can steal. In the case of Alabama, you may have heard the case about the warden in the prison who used the money that was meant to be to feed the inmates to buy himself a beach house in Florida because he stopped feeding the inmates inside the prison and used the money for himself, went to court, came out clean. They didn't prosecute him for that. And that's not how you do things. You can't just pawn off your homeless problem on adjacent states. That's not the way things work. It's your own homegrown problem, but instead of fixing it, you're going to grab it and throw it on somebody else. Escambria County, which is Pensacola, that's the northwesternmost county of Florida, now has a drug overdose death rate of 75 per 100,000. It's the highest in the state of Florida, and it's on par with the city of Philadelphia, which, by the way, if you didn't know, is the most drugged out city in the entire world, with the exception that Philadelphia has like 1 million people, and this is just a county in Florida with like less than 500,000 people. But by per capita percentage, you have the same amount of people in the Pensacola metro area dying from overdoses as you do in Philadelphia. That is an absolute embarrassment. Every time they make these laws in the state of Florida, they'll make the comparison of California. We don't want to become San Francisco. We don't want to become California. People, the overdose death rate in Florida is considerably higher than California. The homicide rate in Florida is higher than California. Number one contributing factor to homelessness is addiction. Florida's overdose rate is considerably higher than California. What makes you think that the homeless population in Florida isn't about the same as California when you have more people in Florida dying from overdoses, which is the leading cause of homelessness to begin with? Retail theft per capita in Florida is higher than California, but Florida makes a new law for retail theft, and they call it the Anti-California Law, despite the fact California has a smaller retail theft per capita than Florida. Well, that's because in California, it's not illegal to shoplift. How stupid do you have to be to not know the difference between total loss per capita and how many people are getting arrested for stealing? It doesn't matter if they get arrested or not. We're not talking about arrest rate. We're talking about total per capita loss. But these people are so stupid that they don't know the difference between per capita versus crime rates. These are individuals who don't know the difference between crime rate and per capita. Like, dude, there's literally people in the 3rd grade who would understand the difference between people being arrested and loss per capita. These are individuals who don't even have a 3rd grade education level, but they're opinionated heavily on a topic, despite the fact they don't even understand what they're talking about. They don't even understand the metrics of the situation. And that's really how dumbed down and stupid people in America have become. I don't know if in other states the education system sucks. But basically, this isn't going to really change anything in Florida. Law enforcement doesn't even give these people due process, doesn't give them any rights. They get accused of crimes, they get processed for crimes, and they don't even have enough money to defend themselves. So it's not like being homeless in Florida is easy. They're just going to make it even harder. The state of Alabama has very strict laws on use, and they also have the worst prison system in the country. So I think what makes Pensacola bad is that Alabama is dumping all of their users and addicts into Florida. So basically, Alabama has the worst prison system and they're very strict on drugs. Thus, the homeless and addicted from Alabama have come to Florida. Pensacola, because it's geographically adjacent. I mean, literally, if you live in Pensacola, you're almost part of the Mobile, Alabama metropolitan area. So when it comes to the city of Pensacola, Alabama has flushed the toilet of all their addicted onto Florida, and now Florida's going to do the same thing onto Georgia, I guess, because Alabama is so strict that the homeless aren't going to go there. Alabama also has anti-homeless laws that make it illegal just to be homeless. So now I guess the state of Georgia is going to take the brunt of all of Florida and Alabama's addiction problem. This isn't really the way things are supposed to work. All these states are in a competition to see who's the best, but they're doing it by dumping their garbage on adjacent states. Take the state of Oregon and Washington have the same problem going on, where one state has a lot of registered offenders because the other state's very strict. In the case of Washington, they're very strict because they're trying to protect their families and children. So the state of Oregon is kind of flooded with all of their homeless registered offenders. Even in the state of Florida, a large percentage of the registered offenders are originally from Washington State because Washington State is trying to protect their families, so they've dumped that problem on other states. Arkansas is another state that's soaked up a lot of registered offenders from other states. So what happens with these laws? This is something that's been happening in the United States for decades now, where one state makes a law and then the problem moves on to the next state. Like California dumped all their gang problems on New Mexico, for example. So now Nevada and New Mexico are dealing with a crime problem that originated in California. So all the while, despite how much the state of Florida criticizes California, it's pretty much using California tactics, which is to make your problems an adjacent state's problem. And while the real estate prices in Florida are not as high as California, if you're renting, it's about the same. The problem that California has with housing affordability is just about to the same level in Florida. In fact, Miami now surpasses many cities in the state of California for affordability. The laws that are taking place in Florida are similar to the laws that California has been enacting. Florida really is becoming California, except for the state of California actually provides social services. The state of California actually has high incomes. The state of Florida offers you nothing, and there isn't good sources of income. And laws like this just go to highlight how the state of Florida is trying to look good on paper, but how they're going about it is definitely unethical. And people are getting sick of it. I mean, just on the insurance side of things, there's literally people whose houses were destroyed by the hurricane and now they're homeless, and now this law comes into place. It's almost like the state of Florida destroyed these people's lives purposely or allowed the insurance companies to do it for them. According to FEMA, one of the number one causes of homelessness in the United States is hurricanes. So next time we get hit by a hurricane, you won't be able to set up a tent outside your own house. These laws and their enforcement simply do not make sense. They're illogical, and it's almost just like sending a message to everybody else or a warning threat, but it really isn't helping the state of Florida. I mean, if you really want to take care of the homeless problem in Florida, a good place to start would be with better access to medical care, especially those who have mental illnesses. Let me hear what you guys think about this topic.